I want to talk about the impact of emigration on people, not on the countries, and in particular the impact both on the people who move or who might move, and on the people in recipient countries. So this is a quote from John Lennon. I don't have any videos. Maybe I can play a sound file. So if you know the song, you'll realize that the next couple of lines are not suitable for this audience. So yesterday, Bob Lucas was talking about economic growth, basically, and this is an older quote along the same lines, where he's thinking about countries that have experienced this kind of explosive growth that was shown in his chart, and countries that have not, and why that's the case, and what one might do to promote that kind of growth in countries that are backward in terms of development. And the line that became kind of famous is that he says once you start thinking about questions like this, it's hard to think about anything else. So what I want to think about is something, in some sense, less ambitious. Instead of thinking about what you would have to do to generate an economic miracle in these countries, I want to think about what would be the consequences of simply allowing people to decide where they want to be, where they want to live, where they want to work. Just drop restrictions on migration. So instead of trying to figure out how to fix the economy in Zimbabwe, just stop preventing people from Zimbabwe, stop preventing them from going wherever they like. They might take the view that this place is incredibly screwed up. There are places that are not screwed up, so let's just go there. Now, it's a one-off, right? So if you did this, I'm going to argue that there would be big gains. It's once and for all. Lucas was thinking about growth that just keeps going and going, so it's less ambitious, as I say, but it's also, in some sense, easier. I mean, we know how to do it. Now, of course, the politicians might have something to say about that, but at least in terms of the mechanics of it, all it takes is just, stop restricting people. So what I want to think about is just quantitatively, what would the effects be? How many people would move? What would they gain from it? What would be the consequences for people in the receiving countries? And I want to think about it as a system-wide change. So there's going to be a lot of approximations involved just to get to some kind of reasonable answer. So I'll start by reviewing some of the differences in incomes and wages across countries, just briefly, and then I want to talk about factor price equalization, which is an old idea in economics, and I want to sort of modify it a bit and explain how it works and how it relates to the consequences of open borders. Then, so I'm doing this with a particular view of why it is that people want to move. And this is a view that emphasizes differences in productivity across countries, differences that are embodied in the countries themselves as opposed to the people. So then I'll talk about the effect of this on wages, how many people would move, and then the punchline is basically how big is the effect on the supply of labor, and finally what is the magnitude of the gain. There's a bunch of papers that I'm not going to talk about this talk is largely based on a paper that came out in the Review of Economic Dynamics this year. So these are numbers that are pretty well known. This is from the Penn World Table, and it just displays the huge variations in GDP per capita across countries in relation to the size of the countries measured in a log scale. And lots of people have studied these numbers and tried to account for these differences by, for example, looking at the capital available to people in these different countries and looking at the human capital as it differs across countries, the extent to which some people in some countries are more educated than in others. And the punchline from these studies is that you can account for some of the differences that way, but huge differences remain after you've done that. In other words, you're left saying that there are big unexplained productivity differences. And what I want to rely on is, so I'm going to take the view that these productivity differences are differences in the productivity of labor. And I'm using data from a study that was done by some people connected with the World Bank, where they got data for 42 less developed countries, data on individual earnings in each of these countries, so kind of like census data for each country. And what they're measuring is the difference in wages for people who move relative to people who don't. So the point of it is to take someone, for example, who grew up in Ghana or grew up in Mexico, went to school there, and then migrated to the US, so that you find people in the US Census who came from various different countries, each of these 42 countries, and you measure how much they're earning in the US. And then you go to the data for the sending country and essentially match up people. So you take somebody who is a high school graduate from Ghana, who went to high school in Ghana, one who is working in the US, one who is working in Ghana, and you compare the wages. So you're trying to measure the difference in productivity of a worker who crosses the border. And these differences are very big. They're laid out on the horizontal axis in this picture, and they're on the vertical is this GDP per person. So for instance, the figure for Mexico, so these are internet domain names to label countries, the figure for Mexico is about 40%. So what it's saying is that an average Mexican worker, when compared with a similar worker in Mexico, so an average Mexican migrant is making about 2.5 times in the US what that person would be making in Mexico. The figure for Ghana is about 7. So, and as I say, these are same education, essentially the same person. So I'm going to read these as differences in productivity, differences in the productivity of labor, so that you become more productive simply by crossing the border. And I mean, that seems to be the view of the migrants themselves. They desperately want to cross the border, and presumably that's because they perceive that they'll be much more productive. Now, this is not quite the same thing as measuring income per worker, although obviously it's related. This is the same data on wages, but here you have income per worker, and the difference is that the amount of human capital that an average worker has in Ghana is generally going to be less than the human capital of an average worker in the US, so you're not comparing like with like. This picture also illustrates that the numbers are kind of fuzzy. There's a couple of Egypt and Venezuela here that kind of stand out as odd observations. So I don't want to argue that these are exact measurements of relative productivity, but I think on the whole, they give a good sense of what the relevant magnitudes are. Now, if you do the same kind of exercise for capital, you get quite different answers. This is from a paper by Caselli and Ferrer, where they're looking at the productivity of capital measured by the rate of return across countries. That's on the vertical axis here. And the same wage information is on the horizontal. The US is included in this picture, and as you can see these are wages relative to the US. The US is a huge outlier in terms of wages, but not really in terms of capital. So if you were to say that the return to capital is much the same from one country to another, while the wage differences are huge, that's a decent approximation. Now, so I want to argue that if you're going to analyze what's supposed to happen, if you're going to try and imagine what's going to happen when you open the borders, you kind of need a theory of where these wage differences come from in the first place. And there's this old argument that there shouldn't be any wage differences, that merely preventing people from moving doesn't imply that there are going to be big differences in wages. And the argument is that even if the people can't move, and indeed even if the machinery can't move, the capital can't move, nevertheless, the stuff that these people and these machines are producing, that stuff is moving more or less freely across borders. And so if you have arbitrage in the market for the products that are being produced, that kind of arbitrage, that is the force that makes sure that the price is going to be more or less the same from one country to another, the price of corn or the price of tractors or whatever it might be, that feeds back into the prices of the factors that produce this stuff, namely the price of labor and the price of capital. So this is kind of important. So I want to spend a few minutes on this picture. It's not as complicated as it looks, and I think it matters. What it is it's a picture of, so there's a family of blue curves here representing how much it would cost to produce some product. I mean, pick your favorite product. So this would be, it would depend on the prices of the factors that you're using to produce. It depends on what you're paying for your workers. It depends on how much you're paying for the machines that you use. So it's plotted in relation to the wage rate and the price of capital. And this family says that as you go northeast in this picture, it's getting more and more costly to produce this stuff because you're having to pay more for the inputs. And then there's one curve drawn as a tick curve here that represents the cost that would just allow you to break even. So there's some world price, P1, that all of the producers of this product have to deal with. They have to match that price. And so if you're going to break even at that price, your inputs should cost you some combination along that curve. And if, I guess I'm flipping through this a bit fast, but so you should be on this thick one if you're going to break even. Now, it would be nice if you were on a lower curve, but of course if you were, so would everybody else be, and the price would fall. So you're just breaking even on that one. There's another family of curves in orange which refers to some other product that's also getting produced in this same economy, and where the producers of that product have to break even relative to a world price, P2. And the argument is simply that if you have to be on this thick curve here, to break even for one good, and on the orange one to break even for the other good. And if in this country there are producers who are succeeding in both goods, and they're buying labor in the same market, and they're buying machines in the same market, then the implication is that you've determined what the wage has to be, and you've determined what the price of capital has to be. And you've done that for this country, and then by exactly the same argument, you've done that for any other country that's producing these same two goods. So any two goods that are produced under competitive conditions in two different countries force the prices of the inputs to be the same, in particular, force the wage rate to be the same. So that's the arbitrage argument. It's a very beautiful argument. It's a very simple argument, and it's obviously wrong. But the question is why? Now, the simplest. So the point I'm trying to make is you can't just proceed without having some coherent view of why this thing is wrong, why it is that we see such huge differences in wages across countries. And the simplest way to reconcile this is just to say that productivity is systematically different, that it's much harder to be productive in Ghana than to be productive in the US. Now, I'm not going to say anything about the reasons behind that. I'm just going to take that as given. And obviously that's an approximation, unless you have some understanding of that. You've got to worry that the implications aren't going to work very well. But so I'm just going to take the factor price equalization logic, this logic that says the wage should be the same everywhere, and reinterpret it in terms of these productivity differences. So what I'm saying is the productivity differences are what we call labor augmenting. So just by moving across the border, you become more productive. So I'm going to use this A to refer to what I'll call efficiency units of labor, and the number of efficiency units that you have depends on where you're working. And I'm going to take the US and other developed countries as places where you would have one efficiency unit per worker. And then I'm going to say that if you're in Mexico, you only have 0.4 efficiency units. Now, the important part about this is that this is saying that the cost of labor, from the point of view of a producer, the cost of labor is the same in the two countries. And the reason is that if you take 5 workers in Mexico, they can produce what 2 of them could produce in the US. So if you're hiring workers to produce stuff, it's going to be equally costly for you in both places, and that's what allows this factor price equalization logic to work. Now the big difference, so this is just saying once you adjust for these efficiency differences, you get back the same equalization argument. The big difference between this and the standard version is now we have a reason why people want to move. In the standard logic, the wage is going to be the same everywhere, so there's no reason for anybody to want to move machines across the border. There's no reason for workers to want to move across the border. Now there's a strong reason. But it also means that when people move, there's no effect on these relative wages. The relative wages are pinned down by these efficiency differences. So if you have 30 million people moving from Mexico to the US, that's not going to affect this ratio. It's still going to be the case that workers in the US are 2.5 times as productive as the same workers were in Mexico. So this is saying that this is a quote from a paper by Michael Clemens saying that the policy barriers are what sustain these large wage ratios. I'm saying no, this is coming from underlying efficiency differences. And it also means that when people leave the country, that has no effect on the wages of the people who stay behind. The only effect is going to be that you're going to magnify the supply of labor on the world market, and that's going to reduce wages for everybody, and that's one of the things I want to quantify. So what happens when you open borders is you change the total amount of effective labor on the world market. You're going to magnify the supply of labor, because you're going to take workers who had 40% of an efficiency unit and convert them into 100%. And you do that across a whole bunch of sending countries and just add up. And this will give you a calculation of what the change in labor supply is. That's going to reduce the real wage, and I want to know how big that effect is going to be. So obviously it depends on how many people are going to move, and I'll come back to that. But the way this works, I mean, I'm doing this in the context of a kind of a simple mathematical structure of what the production technology looks like, what the relationship is between the inputs and the outputs. The simplest version of that is you get this logarithmic relationship between the relative price of the inputs, the price of labor relative to capital, and the real wage, which you can think of as just how long you have to work in order to earn enough to buy whatever it is that you want to buy. And it's also the case that you get a proportional relationship between basically the number of machines per worker and the relative prices of these inputs. Now you put these things together using kind of reasonable guesses about the parameter values, and the answer is that if you were to double the world labor supply, so if it were the case that by opening all of the borders you would effectively double the amount of labor supplied to the world market, in that case the real wage would fall by 20%. Now I was surprised by that number. You might think that the effect on real wages would be a lot bigger than that, but of course there's, you're augmenting the labor supply. This calculation you're holding the capital constant, but the upshot is that the effect on the real wage is actually relatively small. So you have this effect, it's the same everywhere. It reduces, in some sense, it reduces the wages of everybody, but the migrants have this gain from the gain in efficiency. Now that's a short-run thing. The other consequence of this is that the return to capital improves. You've got more workers per machine, you're getting a higher return on the machines. So there's a strong incentive to increase the capital stock. And the way we think about that is that the capital stock is eventually determined by this trade-off where you could either produce stuff that you want to consume now, or you could produce things like tractors that will then be used to produce stuff that you're going to consume later. And that balance depends on how impatient you are, whether you really want it now or you're willing to wait. Depends on how good these machines are, how long they'll last. Will you get a steady flow of extra consumption, or will this just be a short-term thing? And of course on how costly it is to produce the machine. But in any case, the effect of migration is going to tilt this balance in favor of producing more capital goods. So whatever the balance was before, now you have a lot more labor in effective terms, and so there's a stronger incentive to accumulate capital, and that persists until you get back to the same ratio that you had to begin with. So the long-run effect of this is that you get back to the same capital-labor ratio, and once that happens, you're back to the original real wage. So the implication is a short-term effect of 20% reduction in the real wage. Long-term effect is nil. The people who don't move are the losers in the short run, this 20% wage reduction, and the migrants, at least most of them, are the gainers. Now, so in order to put magnitudes on this, the thing you need to know is how many people are going to move. Your first inclination is to say you open up the border, everybody moves. Mexico empties out, everybody lives in the US. That's not what's going to happen. The clearest example of that is Puerto Rico, which does have an open border with the US, and Puerto Rico certainly hasn't emptied out. When you look at migration, for example, internal migration in the US, even in the US, there are big gains from moving from low-wage states to high-wage states. And so you're tempted to conclude that since you don't see many people moving, it's about 3% a year for high school graduates, for example, in the US, you're tempted to conclude that the moving costs must be really big. But some people do move, so they can't be, the cost can't be that big. More importantly, lots of people move the wrong way. And lots of the same people move the wrong way. They move from Puerto Rico to the US, and there's a very strong proportion of those migrants who actually move back again. So the conclusion really is there's a lot of this migration that actually has nothing to do with income. That people are moving for all sorts of other reasons, and they have different costs of moving. It's costly for some people to move, much less so for others, and the people who do move are the ones who have relatively low costs. So what I want to think about is some simple notion that would allow you to say how many people will actually move, because once you know that, then you know how big the effect on the labor supply would be. So this is from an earlier paper with Jim Walker, and this refers to internal migration in the US. And what it is just take all the wages that you see in the US data and take the wages for one state and raise it by 10%. So for example, this is California or Illinois or New York, raise it by 10% or reduce it by 10%. And we've estimated this model of how people make migration decisions, interstate migration decisions, and so we just simulate this model and ask what they would do if you conducted that experiment. Just increase the wage 10% and hold it there indefinitely. And this is tracking responses over years, and what you see is there's actually a pretty substantial response, but it's quite slow. And the reason for that is you have all of this other activity, people moving for all these other reasons. You've kind of shifted things a little bit in favor of California or wherever it is, but it takes quite a long time for that effect to work its way through. That's for high school graduates. The similar thing for college graduates. College graduates move a good deal more, but again, the response is quite slow. Now that's going to be important in relation to what's going on with capital. The other thing that you learn from looking at migration data is that people are very strongly attached to their home location. So I mentioned already people going back to Puerto Rico. Most of the Mexican migrants go back to Mexico, or at least a large share of them do. And the way I want to think about that is you have this attachment to home for everybody, stronger for some people than for others. And what the simplest version of this is you end up saying that the proportion of people who stay is equal to the relative wage. Now, I don't want to get into that's just a simple distribution of moving costs and some notion of how people value the gains. But in any case, it works pretty well at least for Puerto Rico. The relative wage, by this measure I was talking about that these World Bank guys did, the relative wage Puerto Rico relative to the US is 2/3. And indeed, if you look at the people who were born in Puerto Rico, and they all have the option to live and work in the US, 2/3 of them choose to stay in Puerto Rico. So that's what I'm going to use to quantify the flows that would result from a relaxation of restrictions on immigration. And I'm going to just divide the world into two groups of countries. One will be frontier countries, which is countries that already have an efficiency level of 100%. So this is, they're actually quite heterogeneous, but this is the US here with GDP just under 50,000 a year. All of the EU countries, a couple of strange countries like Qatar and Luxembourg. But basically, the cutoff is 25,000 a year in 2009 GDP per person. It's arbitrary, but I'm just going to define that as countries that people would move to. And I'll include in this other countries that already have open borders with these frontier countries, which is to say other countries in the European Union who are not at this income level, plus Puerto Rico. So that's those countries, and then these are going to be descending countries, which is all the rest of them. And again, this is the $25,000 cutoff. It goes way down. So Zimbabwe is down around $150 per person. Cote d'Ivoire is not much higher, and the big countries are India and China here. Now I should say this is a little bit out of date, but the nature of the exercise is take all of these countries and say there's some gain for natives of these countries if they move to the frontier countries. The magnitude of the gain is this relative wage, and the proportion of them who choose to move is governed by that relative wage. If you do that, so I'm doing it here just for the countries where I have decent measures of relative wages. That's the ones that are on the plot, and I'm assuming kind of standard numbers for the other countries. But this is just saying here's the magnitude of the change in effective labor that would result from this. And the summary is, roughly you're doubling the world labor supply. So you're dropping all of the restrictions on migration. You're moving people, if they choose to move, they'll be more productive at the other end. And the extent of the increase is, in fact, about 100%. So by what I was saying before, the effect on the real wage, the immediate effect on the real wage, if everybody were to move instantly, which of course they won't, the immediate effect would be a 20% reduction in the real wage for everybody. Now, that's just the magnitude of the change. I want to know what's the gain, and I want to know what's the gain net of the cost of moving. Right? So the easiest way to do that is to say, well, the marginal migrant, the one who's just having a hard time deciding whether to move or not, it obviously has a gain of 0. If you take at the other end somebody who is not, in fact, attached to their home location at all, so the moving cost is 0, and then take an average of those, then you end up saying that the gain for the average person is just kind of half of the relative wage, right? So at one end there's no gain, at the other end there's the full amount, and on average halfway in between. And that's what this looks like, and this is more or less the punchline of the paper. So this red line is an average across all of the countries in the original data set. So this is, again, these 42 countries. You're looking at the net gain per worker averaged over all of the people in that sending country. and the number comes out at 10,800 per year per person, where the average is taken over those who move and those who don't move. So the ones who move gain a lot more than that. The ones who don't are kind of entered as zeros here. It varies across countries, although I don't want to put too much weight on any one country because the data probably won't support it. But this average number is what I'm really after. The average income per person in those countries is about 8,600. So that's a gain of about 125%. If you throw in all of the other countries, now, as I say, the measurement is fuzzier in this case, but still not bad. The average over all of the countries away from the frontier, is about 10,000, a little over 10,000 per person, and that's relative to an average income of about 9,000. So this gives you the basic result of the paper, that you're going to take an average person in an underdeveloped country and double their income simply by relaxing these restrictions on migration. So, I mean, it's a very unpopular idea, the idea that you should open the border. I think there's two, well, I mean, there are lots of things that I haven't talked about here, impacts on culture, impacts on welfare systems. I'm just talking about the pure impact on wages. But I think there are two big reasons why this is sort of an unpopular idea. The biggest one, I think, is that the people who would gain essentially have no voice in this. And this is kind of getting back to something that Cardinal George was talking about earlier, that we've divided the world up into these kind of arbitrarily defined countries. And if you're going to move from one country to another, nobody is speaking on your behalf in the destination country, and in the sending country, there's no real support for sending you either. So you could imagine having a vote once and for all where everybody in the world gets one vote, and it's a referendum on whether the borders should be open or not. My guess is it might pass if you conducted that kind of a vote. But in any case, I think that there's good political reasons why this is unpopular. But the other thing I think is that the consequences are not well understood. I think there is this implicit fear that if you had open borders, that all hell would break loose. And this calculation is saying, no, it would have effects on wages, but there would be huge gains for the people who move. And also that the effects on the wages are smaller than you would, at least than I would have expected, and they're temporary. And they're temporary in relation to the speed at which capital grows and the speed at which people move. Now, people move quite slowly. That was the point of those pictures, that people respond to even big incentives over a relatively long period of time. In the meantime, there's a strong incentive to increase the capital stock, and if these proceed at the same rate, there's no effect on the real wage. There's no reduction in the real wage associated with this. And you could, to some extent, control the rate at which these things change. If you're going to open up the border, you don't necessarily have to do it instantly. You could delay a bit. So, in the end, it's a different way to reduce poverty, and it's a very powerful way to reduce poverty.